So, my objectives here are basically to contextualize the history of university education in Brazil, to trace the history of Tolkien's publication in the Portuguese language, and to examine the impact of Tolkien in Brazil and how his works are perceived. So, with no further ado, let us begin with Brazil itself. So, this is Brazil. Although it may seem large, I think it is even bigger than one might expect, since my home state, the state of São Paulo here, is by itself as large as the whole United Kingdom. And if we try to fit other countries inside Brazil, we can see that the state of Rio de Janeiro here is as big as Denmark, the Amazon region as big as Mongolia, Mato Grosso do Sul as large as Germany, Minas Gerais as Spain, Bahia as France, and so on. This is just to give you a sense of what it means to be the fifth largest country in the world, behind only Russia, Canada, the United States, and China. Brazil is also the largest country in both South America and Latin America, with one of the 10 largest economies in the world in both nominal and PPP terms, and the largest economy in the entire Southern Hemisphere. Although Brazil faces issues such as crime and corruption, Brazilian culture has a long history of renowned intellectuals and strong cultural ties to other countries. Here, for example, is one of our former emperors, Dom Pedro II, who was a friend of major intellectual figures of the 19th century, such as the composer Richard Wagner, the novelist Victor Hugo, and the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Despite this, colonization had a profound impact in Brazil's history, for during centuries, if intellectuals wished to study anything besides law and medicine, they had to seek it abroad, because until 1920, Brazil did not have a single university in its entire territory. But, better late than ever, the first university in Brazil was founded in 1920, in Rio de Janeiro, followed by the foundation of the University of São Paulo in 1934, and many others in the following years. However, as Brazil did not have enough academics to teach in them, we had to import our intellectuals. The most famous of them probably being Claude Lévi-Strauss, a Belgian-born French anthropologist who taught in Brazil and wrote extensively about its culture. But how about Tolkien? What does a philologist and fantasy author have to do with all of that? I believe we should not forget that Tolkien was also a man born in a land still in development. For he was born in Bloemfontein in the present-day South Africa, at the end of the 19th century, when the Orange Free State was not very different from Brazil. Tolkien's father, Arthur Tolkien, received an offer to become the manager of the British Bank there, and he did not only remain in South Africa, but also died there, and he is still buried there to this day. You may argue that this is a very weak connection between these two subjects, but it is not, for Tolkien, after finishing his undergraduate degree and while attempting to become a professor, whatever he could, was invited to become a professor of English at Cape Town University. As Carpenter says in his biography, during his first term there, he was invited to submit his name as a candidate for 2 professorships of the English language, the Baines Chair at Liverpool and the new De Beers Chair at Cape Town. He sent in his applications, Liverpool turned him down, but at the end of 1921, Cape Town offered him the post. In many ways, he would have liked to accept. It would have meant a return to the land of his birth, and he always wanted to see South Africa again, but he refused the job. Edith and the baby were in no fit state to travel, and he did not want to be separated from her. So why did Tolkien long for South Africa, given that it is well recorded that his mother did not appreciate the years spent there, and that Tolkien himself, while still a baby, had numerous health issues due to the climate? Why did he want to return there? And why did his father, unlike his mother, enjoy staying there so much? Well, before I attempt to try to answer these questions, let me return to Brazil. We were talking about the rise of universities in Brazil, and the introduction of Tolkien in Brazil is a very unusual story. We all probably know the story about Tolkien's unofficial publication in the United States by Ace Books in the 60s. But what is even more curious is that the same thing happened in Brazil in the 70s. For those unaware of it, The Lord of the Rings had an officially licensed edition in the United States since its release in the UK. But in 1965, a publishing house called Ace Books decided to publish it in a cheaper editions with no legal rights. These ones. In response, the official publisher released a paperback version with the phrase, "the authorized edition," in its cover, creating a dispute in the North American market, where two competing versions of the same book were circulating. Those are the official authorized editions by Ballantine Books from the same year. Similarly, the publishing house from Rio de Janeiro called Arte Nova, which means new art, published an unofficial translation of The Lord of the Rings between 1974 and 1979, using the same covers as the authorized editions of Ballantine Books. Perhaps so as not to make the situation too obvious, but this time dividing it into 6 volumes, respecting the internal division of the book, while ignoring the appendices entirely. Most likely, they wanted to replicate in Brazil the enormous success that Tolkien had in the States. These, as you might probably be asking, these are the titles of the 6 volumes. They kept the 3 original ones and created 3 new ones. First book, The Magical Land. The second book, The Peoples of the Ring. They translated a bit different from The Fellowship. They thought people would be a nice title. Third book, the 2 titles. The fourth, The Ring Comes Back. Fifth book, The Siege of Gondor, which is a pretty good title. And finally, The Return of the King. Soon after, The Hobbit was also published. And these editions were not only the first editions of the book in Brazil, but also the first editions ever in the Portuguese language. They apparently sold well, though not in the enormous quantities seen in the United States. And for a long time, these were the only editions that Brazilian readers could find. As you can imagine, the translations were not very accurate, and Tolkien himself would certainly have been very angry had he known them. For example, the editors added an O at the end of Gandalf, making Gandalfo, probably because they thought Brazilian readers would have difficulty pronouncing names ending in a consonant, something uncommon in Portuguese. But despite that, there are some generally creative translations, such as pacolé, an archaic Portuguese word meaning cotton maker, all used to translate, guess what? Samwise Gamgee's surname. A good example illustrating the difficulty of translating Tolkien is in the first translation of The Hobbit in Portuguese in 1963 from Portugal, in which the translator simply thought that the word hobbit would not make sense to the Portuguese reader and translated it as gnomo, gnome in Portuguese, meaning that the hobbit was then called the gnome. Tolkien himself did not appreciate this and asked immediately that it be changed. And as we can see in this picture of him in his library, there are a few copies of the gnome in the background. And from his expression here, we can surely presume that he did not like it at all. I'm not sure whether Tolkien's temperament was the cause of it, but in the later translations of his work in Portugal, they decided simply to keep all the names in their original form, such as in the first Portuguese translation of The Lord of the Rings in 1980. But coming back to Brazil. Naturally, the situation of The Lord of the Rings being published unofficially could not last long, and in the 1990s, a new publishing house, a respected one, famous for publishing books written or translated by academics, Martins Fontes, finally published the authorized edition of The Lord of the Rings in 1995. Lenita Rimori Esteves translated the prose, and Almiro Pizeta translated the poetry, both professors of English literature at the University of São Paulo. In the following years, they published a series of Tolkien's books, such as The Hobbit, The Silmarillion, Unfinished Tales, and even his academic works, such as his translation of Beowulf and the essay on fairy stories, part of Tree and Leaf. These were my first contacts with Tolkien personally, and also the first for many people who read Tolkien in Brazil for more than 20 years. But everything changed in 2017, when the Brazilian branch of HarperCollins was created and bought the rights to Tolkien's works from Martins Fontes, beginning to publish all of Tolkien's works again from scratch. Although Martins Fontes was a good publisher, it was limited by its circumstances. Being an academic publishing house meant it did not have the structure to always keep all the books in stock at good prices and in prestigious hardcover editions. I remember, for instance, that between 2012 and 2014, when the Hobbit movies were being released, the shelves contained several editions of The Hobbit, but none of The Lord of the Rings, which was out of stock. Something inconceivable to me, as I certainly knew that people would read The Hobbit and then probably want to read its sequel. So, HarperCollins began publishing new editions of Tolkien's works, beautiful, fairly priced, and with all the treatment the work deserved. The new translations were made by different Tolkien scholars, although there was some criticism from the readers. Some complained that the former translations were better simply because they were already accustomed to the old terms, while others argued that the new translations made the text more complicated than Tolkien's original. All of this culminated in 2019, when the new edition of The Lord of the Rings was published, translated by Ronald Kirmsey, a major Tolkien expert who had been reading Tolkien deeply since the 70s, and had already translated several of Tolkien's works during the Martins Fontes era. He also published a book about Tolkien called Explicando Tolkien, Explaining Tolkien, whose cover has become an icon to every Brazilian Tolkienist visiting Exeter College. Here is an example of people trying to replicate its cover. Naturally, people were eager to see how The Lord of the Rings would look when translated by Kirmsey. And in 2019, the result appeared. At first, critics attacked it, but in the end, the controversy faded, and only a few people still complain about it, claiming that they find it awkward or claiming that the older translation was simply better. These events are the product of a phenomenon that English readers may not be familiar with, since they have the privilege of reading Tolkien in its original language. But in other contexts, Tolkien translation has become a subject of study in itself, because translating Tolkien, and fantasy in general, is not simple. I would dare to say that translating The Lord of the Rings is almost as arduous as translating Ulysses by James Joyce, because the translator faces the same problem. Countless words that do not exist, which we call in linguistics neologisms, words created for specific goals and specific circumstances. Most neologisms in The Lord of the Rings appear in proper names, characters, and places, such as Baggins, Bagend, Oliphant, Balrog, Palantir, Werewolves, Wormtongue, and so on. These names are tricky, not only because they are invented, but because all of them have meanings behind them, intentionally crafted by Tolkien the philologist. For example, Bracegirdle is a Hobbit surname that should sound like an English surname while also carrying a Hobbit-like meaning, an association with eating a lot of food and stretching the Bracegirdle. Rivendell comes from to cleave plus dell, which is valley in Old English, meaning then cleft valley. Orc comes from Old English for demon, but is also a phonetic adaptation of orc, a Sindarin word in Tolkien's world. So, what should translators do in these cases? Mistakes like the gnome in Portugal and similar issues in other languages led Tolkien himself to write a guide to the name in The Lord of the Rings, in which he explains in detail what should be translated and what should be kept. A good example showing how the new Brazilian translators follow the guide is in the plural of dwarf. Tolkien uses dwarves with V, unlike the usual dwarfs, like, for example, in the Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. In earlier Portuguese translators, the plural of anão, dwarf, was simply anões, dwarfs, the regular plural. But in Kirmsey translations, he opted for anãos, a slightly different spelling that looks strange to Portuguese readers, but was in fact a possible spelling until the 17th century. Another example is the translation of Shelob, a name that comes from the pronoun she plus lob, Old English for spider, meaning then she spider. In the translation in Portuguese, we have ela, the pronoun she in Portuguese, plus arachna, the Latin word for spider, forming larachna, which preserves the antiquity and strangeness of the original. Barrow white also derives from Old English, barrow from bjork, mountain or burial mound, and white from with, creature. The Portuguese translation likewise uses archaisms to recreate the same effect. Coisas, an unusual word for things, and tumulares, of the grave. Again, some people complained, saying that this was unnecessary since everyone was already used to the regular plural of dwarf. And some who did not know the original even claimed that anãos must be a misspelling that no one had noticed. Although this particular choice has a clear justification, we may leave readers free to choose which translation they prefer. As with translations of classical Greek, Roman, and medieval works, there is rarely a single definitive translation. Different translations serve different goals: accuracy, readability, accessibility, and so on. Nonetheless, despite the criticisms, HarperCollins has achieved such a large reach that it is now responsible for Tolkien's reception across the entire Portuguese-speaking world. Before the pandemics, I remember communicating with a man from Angola, a Portuguese-speaking country in Africa. I asked him about the translations of The Lord of the Rings in his country, wondering whether they were Angolan Portuguese editions. And he told me that the editions available were imported from Portugal. But now, after Kirmis's translations and the mass printing by HarperCollins, the scenario has changed. Brazil has taken on the role of spreading Tolkien's works in Portuguese. For example, I found a picture of an Angolan bookshop advertising The Lord of the Rings using the Brazilian editions. And if you still have any doubt that Brazil has become a true ambassador of Tolkien's literature, you should know that we recently became one of the only 2 countries in the world to translate all the 12 volumes of the history of the Middle Earth, the other being Spain. And as you can imagine, Brazilian academia now has a great wealth of Tolkien's text to study. Speaking of that, we should now turn to the academic reception of Tolkien in Brazil. As I mentioned earlier, how do we As I mentioned earlier, academia in Brazil was established relatively recently and was shaped by many intellectuals from France. And even today, few academic English speakers venture either to study Brazil or to study in Brazil. The major influences are French and secondly Spanish, especially from Latin America due to linguistic proximity and geographical closeness. So what does that mean? That English works are not much studied in Brazil? Well, that too. But it also means that Brazil is not accustomed to thinking in an English way. The French and Spanish-speaking worlds, especially Latin America, have a standard theoretical approach deeply influenced by the 20th century intellectuals such as Gerhard Janet, Roland Barthes, Otávio Paz, and some German-speaking intellectuals such as Walter Benjamin, Georg Lukács, and Bertolt Brecht. In other words, structuralism, post-structuralism, Marxism, and materialism. I do not need to explain that through these lenses, fantasy is often labeled as childish and unimportant, not to mention more offensive terms like product of capitalism, mass industry entertainment, imperialist propaganda, or simply dumb. This means that finding value in Tolkien's works, C.S. Lewis's works, science fiction works, Gothic literature, etc. becomes a challenge because you face not only prejudice, but also decades of tradition asserting that your work has no value. People often report hostility at universities for studying authors such as H.P. Lovecraft. Arthur C. Clarke, Neil Gaiman, and even more canonical writers such as Mary Shelley, Bram Stoker, and George Orwell. Clearly, the fantasy mode bothers academia, and although for different reasons, I suppose that here in Britain, there are also academics who would turn up their noses at hearing the name of these authors. But as an irony of fate, it always seems that when people tell you not to do something, that is exactly what you want to do, right? And when academia tells you not to look at certain authors, those are precisely the ones people want to study. As recorded in a book called Leaves of the Tree, a book organized by my supervisor in Brazil, Cido Rossi, and as you know, here he is, because the great eye is always looking. The first academic work in Brazil was published, the first academic work concerning Tolkien in Brazil was published in 1984. I had a feeling that the year 1984 would show up when I mentioned George Orwell. It was a master's dissertation called The Lord of the Rings, Structure and Meaning. It was written by Lucia Lima Polacchini, then a student of translation at my home university. It is worth noting that when she wrote it, only the unofficial translation of the book existed, and the Silmarillion and unfinished tales were available only in English. And yet, she managed to present Tolkien's mythology to an academic audience completely unfamiliar with it. I have tried several times to contact her in order to interview her about what it was like to read Tolkien at a time when no one in Brazilian academia had heard of him. But unfortunately, I have never succeeded. All I was able to find is that she did not continue in academia and became a court-appointed translator. Today, she would be almost 70 years old, I presume, and nothing else has been written about her. However, I did find one precious detail. Her supervisor, Carlos Dalian, was one of Brazil's first Edgar Allan Poe scholars. And that matters, because at that time, Poe suffered the same prejudice Tolkien suffers today for writing horror fiction. Fortunately, Poe is now recognized as a great author in Brazil. At least someone succeeded. So it is likely that Dalian agreed to supervise a study on a non-prestigious writer because he suspected the situation might change someday. And yes, things have indeed changed. As we can see here, this is a print of a website developed by my Tolkienist friends of the Ent Tolkien study group, of which I have the pleasure of being a member, in which they have recorded all the studies concerning Tolkien in Brazil, all the articles, all the essays, all the books, all the chapter books, all the theses from master's dissertations and doctoral theses, and including many fields of knowledge, even geology, for example. There is a study about Middle-earth soil. And we now have an enormous amount then of academic work on Tolkien in recent years. After the master's dissertation in 1984, the first doctoral thesis came in 1997 here. And until 2022, 11 more doctoral theses were written. If we consider only the pre-pandemic period until 2020, we have a total of 6 doctoral theses on Tolkien, these ones. But from the pandemics onwards, we have an astonishing number of 14 additional doctoral theses, according to the updated supplement that I have prepared. Seeing these numbers, we may conclude that Tolkien read a lot of Tolkien during the pandemics, or actually more precisely, that interest in Tolkien is greater than ever before, even greater than during the years of Peter Jackson's adaptation of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. We now have many Tolkien scholars teaching, researching, and publishing more and more papers on Tolkien, such as I have mentioned, my supervisor, Cido Rossi, also Cristina Casagrande, which is called in Professor Pettini's recently published book, Stefano Stanley, Reinaldo José Lopes, Sérgio Pirassoli, Aline Duarte Rufo, Diego Cortal, and others whom I cannot mention here for the sake of brevity. So what is the cause of it? Of course, As with all good questions, there is not just one answer. Several factors contributed. Tolkien scholarship is growing worldwide. New books, new academic initiatives, new events, YouTube channels, online content. Tolkien is more alive than ever. The Amazon series kept Tolkien's name relevant, though perhaps not in the way Amazon expected. Opinions remain divided. Some praise it, others criticize it for not following the books closely. But this division may have driven many readers back to Tolkien's original works, discovering that the books are much deeper and far more moving. However, I believe the most important element is neither of these. I believe it is connected to the moment in which we are living now. Despite the persistent claim that fantasy is alienating and irrelevant to understanding the real world, we live in a world modernized to a level Tolkien could never have imagined. Artificial intelligence, drone attacks, viruses capable of destabilizing the economy of an entire country. Not only that, but paranoia about war, people turning against one another, attempts of coup d'etat. Does any of this sound familiar to you? It was in a similar context that Tolkien started to write his own books. And that is why he's shown us that not only is all of this chaos temporary, but that there is hope. Hope that people will realize that different peoples and different languages can coexist. That unity is not the same as uniformity. And that if more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world. To conclude, I return to that open question about why Tolkien wished to accept a position in South Africa. In the end, I believe that the answer is the same as why Tolkien has become so beloved in Brazil. The answer is that in these countries, people are still more integrated with the natural world. Although there are highly industrialized regions, there are also landscapes barely touched by mechanization. And that is precisely what Tolkien cherished. Ever since he left his beloved Sherhole as a child, he longed for a simple life, a longing that he immortalized in the Shire. It is a simplicity still found in many places in Brazil, among humble people who cultivate organic food, enjoy peace and tranquility, and remain far from war and from the latest mechanisms. People who, like Tolkien's small heroes, show true courage by fighting against all odds. In Tolkien's view, unrestrained mechanization was anti-life. Such is modern life, Mordor in our midst. Bilbo Baggins tells Frodo that there is only one road in the world, and all doorsteps lead to it, like a great river with infinite tributaries. And once you set your feet on it, you never know where it might take you. Whether you live in Britain or Brazil, whether you speak English or Portuguese, whether in Europe, Africa, or America, this road is accessible to you. It may connect you with new and unexpected friends, as it led me here from Brazil to University of Oxford. And this road may be harsh sometimes, and so dreadful that it may seem that it will not lead to a happy end, like in our modern era. But Middle-earth and all those who devote their lives to study it will be here to show you that dragons can be defeated. So I would like to close this lecture by reminding you of Bilbo's old walking song. The road goes ever on, down from the door where it began. Now far ahead the road has gone, and I must follow if I can, pursuing it with eager feet, until it joins some larger way, where many paths our errant meet, and whither them I cannot say. Thank you so much.